Hi, everyone, and welcome. As people are joining us, take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat. Give your name, your pronouns, your organization, and your role there and your location. And we will get started very soon. Seeing lots of great introductions in the chat. If you've just joined us, please jump on over there and tell us your name, your pronouns, your organization, the role you have there, and where you're joining us from. I'm going to get started in just 1 minute. All right, I'm going to get us started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Miriam Axelud. I'm going to be moderating this webinar today. I'm the editor-in-chief of Shelter Force. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm coming to you from Albany, New York, where I have a nest of baby sparrows under my air conditioner, which you might hear in the background. Shelter Force, if you're not familiar with us, is a national publication covering affordable housing and healthy communities, and we use the power of journalism to inspire, inform, and hold accountable all those working toward more just, equitable, and thriving communities. And that brings us to the organization that is putting on this webinar. For among those doing that work for more just, equitable, and thriving communities are local community development organizations. And those groups, nearly 6,000 of them across the country, work in underserved communities to do a wide range of stuff: develop affordable housing and commercial space, support small business development, provide social services, and advocate for their communities. And our host today, the Community Opportunity Alliance, is a national nonprofit that builds and strengthens that community development field in order to create conditions where residents can shape the destiny of their neighborhoods, securing their long-term stability, health, and prosperity. And so today's webinar is part of the Grounding Values webinar series put on by the Community Opportunity Alliance, which focuses on key industry challenges and practical tools for community development professionals. And the webinar takes its name from Grounding Values in Research, which was a multi-year research project examining the financial health, the activities, the production, and leadership of community development organizations throughout the United States, which generated some, I would say, long overdue data about their effectiveness and results and challenges. And that research, it underscored the need for the community development field to develop a cohesive identity. And it started to ask questions about the sorts of things the community development field needs to do its work more successfully and more equitably. So today's webinar will explore one of those things, the topic of community development training, and how we specifically ensure that community development professionals are not only technically skilled, but also effective in movement building. So our goal today is to describe what are the in-demand skills for community development professionals? What are the gaps in current training that we need to address as a field, and how do we and might we fill those gaps? So thanks for joining us for this important conversation. Please use the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, which is different than the general chat, to submit questions throughout the webinar. But please do submit questions when you have them. And now I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Joyce.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Joyce Pisnano. I am the Chief Strategy and Impact Officer at the National Coalition for Asian Pacific American Community Development. We're a national coalition of approximately 150 organizations across the country that serve low-income Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities in a multitude of community development fields. Thanks for having me today.
Pass it over to Jeff.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Washburn. I'm a partner with Burlington Associates in Community Development, a consulting firm focused on supporting community land trusts nationally. I've been doing this about a year. Prior to that, and I think part of the reason I'm able to serve on this panel is I served as the executive director for the City of Lakes Community Land Trust in Minneapolis for 21 years. Recently stepping away about a year ago from that post. Part of my work continuing on today is serving as the contract administrator for the Minnesota Community Land Trust Coalition. So I'm working in concert with the leadership of various community land trusts in the state of Minnesota, where I'm joining you all today. Thanks.
Great. Cormac?
Hey there. Morning, my name, or afternoon for me, I suppose. My name is Cormac Malloy. I'm with the training division at NeighborWorks America. NeighborWorks America was founded in 1978 and now has a network of 250 community development and affordable housing organizations in all 50 states, DC, Puerto Rico, and on tribal lands. And we provide a number of services, including grants to our network members, technical assistance, and then also in my role, really our training, which includes large national training institutes like the one that we'll have next month in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which will offer somewhere in the range of 75 to 100 courses and usually has about 1,500 folks in attendance, to individual one-off place-based trainings on a particular course or topic, as well as online trainings that, again, can be part of big national events or more discrete trainings. And we cover 11 training track areas, and I specifically oversee community economic development, community engagement, and revitalization in rural and Native focused. Glad to be here with y'all.
Great. Thank you all. So we're going to jump right in, laying a little bit of groundwork. What do you guys see are the key skills and competencies that community development professionals need, particularly to move beyond technical proficiency to be effective movement builders? And can you throw into that some examples, perhaps, that you've seen where a lack of some of those skills has hindered those movement building efforts?
I'll go first, but I'm not going first every time. Yeah, again, having served for 21 years in a director role, and prior to that, I worked with a NeighborWorks affiliate in a director role for another 3 years. Especially for a smaller CDC, you have to be able to not only understand the technical aspects and the the requirements that are required to get a project done, but you also really need to have a strong understanding of governance, working with a board of directors. As much as you may or may not like policy work, advocacy, and even using that word lobbying, you need to be really dialed in, I think, on the policy front as well. You can't let that slip because so much of, I think, the organization's viability as it relates to funding is really tied to a lot of public funding. And then, I think part of this conversation, at least reading into it, is about the corporatization of community development, right? And this has happened over the last 40 years. It's tough not to make sure that you have alignment with a whole bunch of industry partners. In my case, it was in the affordable home ownership space. And so needing to align ourselves with mortgage lenders, big banks, needing to align ourselves with the realtor industry, appraisers and title companies, and at the same time try to get back to the roots of community development and do that community building work. But what I found was oftentimes to be able to achieve our mission, we needed to align with those corporate stakeholders, and it often required us to partner with more community focused organizations and be really intentional about those partnerships and relationships, and really almost work in concert, because we couldn't go out and be the ones that were throwing eggs at a big bank, because we needed that bank, not only for funding, not only for financing, but also for mortgage loans for the folks that we were serving, but to align with organizations to help kind of with that advocacy work, that I think a lot of community building organizations really bring to the table, that I think we couldn't afford to do that to jeopardize our mission.
If you could name the skill there that involved doing both of those things in just a phrase, would you be able to name it?
Flexible, pliable.
Great.
Yeah, if I could hop in a response to that, I think that those are really important, salient points. Sometimes we forget about the governance piece, and that's so critical. We do live in this sort of morass of trying to understand the requirements or the priorities of our government regulators or government funders, our foundations. And so often we're trying to provide a service that's mission driven, but along the parameters of another organization that's trying to like the way you said, that corporatization of community development. And I think a big part of that is also understanding communication. In NeighborWorks, we have a really active community of organizations involved in community building and engagement and community organizing. And in the training and the curriculum development side, I went to them in a project last year ago, the sort of collective or the advisory council we have from our member organizations, and asked a lot of questions about what was really foundational to community building and engagement and what training need or training gap they saw. And I knew a lot of what I expected to hear and did hear most of those things, but the thing that came top of mind for everybody was communication. And I think that was a really salient point. And for a lot of folks who are in that role in a public and resident and consumer facing setting, just that was really important for folks. And it's not just sort of at an entry level or public facing role, but it is like governance has a piece about communication, right? Working with this morass of funders and regulators has a piece about communication. So that's to me really critical. And then I also think centering residents, centering resident leaders and who your community is, and letting them be at the driver's table, or driver's seat rather. And I think understanding the cultural, racial, historical uniqueness of your community is critical and imperative if you're going to get any great work done.
I sort of asked the similar thing I asked to Jeff, but if you had to name a skill that allows folks in leadership position to make sure that they're centering those residents as you describe, how would you describe that?
Communication, leadership, both for yourself and leadership development within the community, and cultural specificity and responsiveness.
Yeah, and I might just build on what Cormac had to say. I 100% agree that really centering the voices of the community members that we serve is really imperative. I think a really strong skill, I'm really sort of latched onto your part of the question around movement building, and it's sort of like, who is part of that movement and who are we trying to engage in that movement? And it really is the communities that we serve. And so I think a really key and critical skill is being the ability to build leadership within sort of the next generations, within the leaders and the community members that we work with. And, that takes relationship building skills. It takes these relational skills that are the soft skills. It's like it's hard to go to a course for relationship building, but yet it's 100% super critical to what builds the movement. And I think oftentimes we think of the project as the output or the outcome, but actually, in the community building, community development work, it's also the relationships and the partnerships that we build that are also equally as important as part of the outcomes of our project. And it's like it's part of the process. And that's how we sort of get to equity in our work, right? Is if we're thinking about sort of the relationships and who's part of that and really paying attention to the process to make sure that it's not extractive, that it's reciprocal to the communities that we work with, then I think that sort of orientation is really, really important. And so in anticipation that you might ask me, like, what's one word? I guess I would say it's relationship building and leadership development in others.
Great. And I do want to follow up in a different way on that, which is, as you said, it's challenging to get training in relationship building, but there's also a question about how can rising community development professionals sort of demonstrate that they have skills in some of those areas, folks who have a capacity for movement building. Are there ways in which we can showcase or identify folks who do have those strengths and to build on them?
If I'm understanding your question correctly, I think kind of depends on the nature of your community and the nature of your organization. If you are a 1 or 2 person community development shop, it's going to look really different than if you're a large affordable housing organization that has managed properties with staff that provide resident services and CB&E and all those things. But I do think it's understanding if you're trying to develop external leaders, it's getting them at the table first and foremost and finding out, and part of that is finding out why they weren't historically. If you're talking about your own staff, I would say then it's not actually a different thing, because I think so often your staff should be derived from the community and should have been those resident leaders. So I don't view them necessarily as distinct.
It feels like, a lot of times if there's a conference or a convention or some sort of a training institute, that oftentimes people putting on these events really tap into the executive directors, and I think there's an opportunity to tap into other folks within organizations that in many cases have way more of the skill sets than the executive director does. I found myself to be very much a generalist of the last 10 years of my working for my former organization, and really just trying to support my great staff. And so while I was there, somebody would say, hey, can you come speak on this? And when it made sense, definitely was trying to lift up some of my colleagues at the office to play that role. Another example, we're putting on this conference here this fall in Minnesota, and purposely are reaching out to the executive directors to say, hey, we need you to really encourage some of your colleagues in your organizations to step up and develop the curriculum as well as present these. And I think it creates a great platform for folks to get up and really show the stuff that they do. I know in my former experiences working for an executive director, I often was like, man, I know more than this person does. I should be the one doing this. And I think to create those opportunities for let people grow and get out in front of larger groups, I think is a great example of doing that.
Yeah, I have nothing else to add. I think that was a really great point. And the more space we make for people who are at all different levels of the organization to represent the organization is wonderful opportunity. I mean, I think I assume all of us at this table have benefited in some way for someone making space for us at the table. So, I think it's about, again, reciprocity and doing the same for other folks who are up and coming.
Yeah, I agree. That's a very good point. So, and Cormac started to touch on this a little bit, but what are the gaps that we have in the current available training and education programs for community development professionals, and are those gaps different for example, professionals of color or other groups?
I can jump in on this one and just share, from the perspective of our network of community development professionals who are, again, primarily Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander. I think one of the things that we hear really often is that oftentimes they feel like the trainers or the coaches or the TA providers don't necessarily understand their communities or the unique conditions in which, those particular practitioners are doing their work. They may not look like them. They may not have lived experiences that reflect the experiences that they have. And so, I think that's a gap. And I think that it's an opportunity to bring in more professionals into those types of roles, to be able to offer that to sort of the next generation or up and coming professionals who are hungry for that. I think that lack of representation has contributed in some ways to a sense of isolation for some practitioners. And so I've seen within our network that there's this real hunger, and the way that they're sort of filling that gap from sort of the sort of professional trainers and coaches is turning to each other, right? Like really leaning into this peer-to-peer experience and peer-to-peer technical assistance. And so our organization has really embraced that. We've really leaned into several models of peer-to-peer technical assistance. And one of the things that we're sort of realizing is a gap for us in that work is that, be a peer-to-peer technical assistance or provider is also a skill in and of itself, right? You may be an expert in knowing how to do something, but that doesn't mean you're an expert in knowing how to teach someone else how to do something. And so that's something that we're trying to develop as an organization. How do we build up those systems to help people feel more confident that they can be those mentors and they can be those coaches? And that just takes, time and resource and really intentionally trying to build a pipeline even for those trainers and coaches.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I could not agree more with the technical assistant component in particular. Like, training is a fantastic tool, but training that doesn't involve any sort of peer learning cohort, technical assistance or coaching after the fact is great, but it's much less likely to actually be implemented, right? So I think that's a key point. And then I also think Joyce's point about lived experiences is critical. I think, if you try and be everything for everybody, you end up being, kind of for nobody. And I don't think that that's the right approach. And I think and hope most of us would agree with that, and I think we have to look at supporting partners where it makes more sense. NeighborWorks is a very large organization with a very large training platform. Sometimes it doesn't make sense for us to create a training when somebody else has it. I'll give you an example. We worked with the Awista Corporation, which serves Indigenous communities and has a fantastic certification program on Native Community Development and Financial Institutions, CDFIs. Rather than us trying to recreate that, why would we do that when we could support an organization that's plugged in, that has members who are on the ground practitioners and relationships with the communities in question, right? Like, it does not make sense for NeighborWorks to try and replicate that when we can support like nascent efforts elsewhere. And I think that's a really critical piece. And then in general, in terms of gaps, I think there's so many things that is asked of community development. And so many things that I think are important that have come to the fore, like areas around climate resilience, for example. But at some point, we also have to remember that we're asking so much of a group of people that are not necessarily, that the number of folks doing that has not necessarily grown. So I think providing sort of a skill set and also a space for practitioners to say, like, there's only so much I can do is really important. And then also skill sets in terms of building out a referral network and partners in other organizations. Again, you do not have to be all things to all people. You're not going to be successful if you try and do that. So really understanding capacity and working in partnerships or working in collaborations, I think, is a key component there.
I would maybe only offer, and I don't necessarily think it's a gap, but I know a lot of communities have, you know, different types of mentorship programs set up where you're paired with organizational members, stat is paired with an executive director of another organization, and to start to break into some of those circles. I mean, again, from my own experience, life got a lot easier when I was allowed to enter into the executive director space in the Twin Cities, and I got to know all the other executive directors. Things just got easier. And what at least I saw in our community was, you know, it was easy for executive directors to get on the phone and talk with one another, but you weren't as likely to get somebody to pick up the phone if you weren't another executive director. So how do we break that down and start to create a larger network so that folks can break into it and cross fertilize what it is that they have, and you know, create those opportunities within other organizations as well.
So the things that we talked about at the beginning, flexibility, relationship building, figuring out how to center community in our work, do you feel that we have trainings that address that? You know, there was some reference that it's, you know, it's tricky things to create in trainings and standard trainings, but do we have that? Are there ways that we can approach that and support community development professionals in learning and practicing those particular skills?
I would say we have a lot of it, but to the point Joyce made about who's delivering the training, like you have to make it relevant to so many different folks. I'm a big believer. I saw some comments, complimentary comments on our training, national training institutes, which I appreciate, but like oftentimes place-based training, just like place-based solutions, makes the most sense. So when you're talking about things that can be harder to measure, you know, like it's community organizing is by nature a harder to quantify, not impossible, of course, but a harder to quantify effort and outcome than some other things like lending, for example. But if you can help people build those basic skills and then apply them to a place-based context, I think you can be successful. And I do think a lot of this content exists, but it's translating it or providing it in a way that meets the moment and also the need and the context of the community. I think that's the bigger gap or the bigger challenge in terms of scale.
I feel like I keep coming back to this. I do think that, you know, trainings were always important, but it was that ability to meet peers in those venues were incredibly helpful. I think increasingly I'm seeing leadership of organizations being able to take advantage of coaches, and I think creating coach opportunities for other people within the organization. And I think, you know, to the points made by Joyce and Cormac, you know, culturally, you know, appropriate, maybe, you know, coaches that look like the folks that are asking for coaching, I think makes a ton of sense. And then my lifeline for most of my existence was a core group of other directors that we would go out at least on a quarterly basis and provide one another support. And one of the first questions I ask of anybody who's struggling in their job is, who is your peer network? Who are you seeing on a regular basis? Who's your core group of folks that can help you through this stuff? Because it's hard. I think working in the community development field is one of the toughest jobs that there is out there, because especially I think in the leadership position, you're required to do so much. There's so much pressure. I know way too many directors who have suffered panic attacks, that don't sleep well, who wake up or don't go to sleep at night because they're constantly worrying about all these different components. It's just not one thing, it's multiple things. And I think that that filters throughout the entire organization as well. And I think making sure that you're intentionally creating support and mechanisms for well-being within your organization is one of the key goals for, I think, leadership of organizations, but also making sure that the board understands that and supports it, and that there's a budgetary item, even when budgets are slim, to support some holistic work within the organization to keep everybody relatively healthy.
Yeah, I would, just plus one what Jeff had to say about sort of having a peer network of folks to support. And, I guess I really, really believe in the power of mentorship, and that mentorship looks like a lot of different ways. I think sometimes we think it's a community development professional who's been doing this for decades that could teach us how to do that. And I have certainly benefited from folks who've played that role with me. But I think mentorship also looks like people in our community telling us how to do things better. They're the ones that are often like, hey, you're not listening. You need to do a better job of listening, or this is the way that we engage in our communities. And so I think if we as professionals really stop to listen to and remember that mentorship looks like different forms. Sometimes they're elders in our community, sometimes they're young people in our community. I think that training is not necessarily a training program, but it's training by experience and through doing, and remembering to kind of stop and reflect as we're doing that.
That's a really great point. Building on that, are there best practices for addressing the specific needs of, and we've touched on this a little bit, but of diverse communities in professional training, or lessons we can pull in from other sectors? And I want to make sure, I know you wanted to speak about language justice, Joyce. I want to make sure that got in.
Yeah, and I don't know that I have exactly like a best practice, but I think it's something that we as an organization have been trying to be better about, is acknowledging language justice is a really key component to bringing in a whole group of folks into this field that maybe haven't historically had access to it. And so thinking about how, when we are offering trainings, when we are, like, just even at our convention that we just had last month, how do we make sure that we're providing access in language to community development professionals who speak English as a second language or have limited English proficiency? And so I think it's a gap, but I think it's also something that, we can learn from other fields about. I see that, for example, like the public health field is really good about making sure that language access is a key part of how they think about ensuring that people can participate in a meaningful way, and so I think community organizers have done a really great job of this and looking at how it looks in community meetings and make sure that happens, but we don't do it at the professional level, right? And so I'm bringing this up because I would just love to see more of that. I think it's really important, and acknowledging that we as an organization even are on this learning journey, that it's not an afterthought, but that it has to be part of the early part of our design in terms of how we think about the ways we bring people together to learn.
Jeff and Cormac, you want to offer some?
I mean, I think language is a critical component, and I also say accessibility generally. I mean, if you don't have a plan for accessibility, you need to, and it's not just like, do I provide larger text manuals or Braille translations? Those things are of course critical, but it's even so much as like visually how you present things for folks who are visually impaired, right? Like, do you have access, where I live in Washington, D.C., I'm very close to the nation's only all-deaf university. And that means that when we do things in this exact community, like, you need to make sure you have the ability to communicate with folks, right? Like, and I think that those are really important things. Lived experience is still a critical best practice. And then I also think making sure your curriculum speaks to a number of different scenarios. Like, I've found in working with our rural organizations that we are more effective when we can go through our curriculum and make sure that we have on a topic like transit-oriented development, which people so often think of as an urban-suburban kind of discussion. Like, how do we do this in a way that includes at least some case studies, at least some activities around making this work in a rural setting, right? Rather than trying to pull it out, and these are our rural courses and they're over here. And sometimes that will be needed, right? But by and large, it's making sure that a curriculum is accessible to real communities from real projects from a number of different backgrounds. And then there's just a question of modality too, right? Like, you know, there's how you do things in person in a large group, in a small place-based setting, like I was talking about, and then there's online. Some folks, if you're going to do things online or you're going to do a hybrid, some folks will want, you know, mostly self-guided content. Some people will want really heavily facilitated content, and that's both scenarios should be available when possible, but you also have to remember the digital divide. And again, I'm not just talking about access to broadband, I'm talking about device access and things like that. And luckily, in the last few years, by necessity, I think some of those concerns have been improved upon, but they're still certainly not solved. And that's a big need as well.
Great. And so one of the challenges is that the community development field and what we're doing and the situations that we're facing are always changing. And sometimes you invest a lot of energy into a training program. How do we keep our training programs, our mentorship programs, et cetera, but particularly I think the training on this front, adaptable and responsive to evolving environment?
Sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
I think part of it, goes back to my earlier comments about, tapping into different people to make sure that they're looking at the curriculum, the trainings from a different perspective, putting them in the facilitative position. Maybe not the same old folks, and I throw myself into that mix, is to say, how do we mix it up, and not be so rigid, and recognize that everything is evolving. I mean, anybody who's been doing this work for even a 5-year period, it's changed so much in the last 5 years, and to recognize that, and to make sure that there's policies in place that say we're gonna take a look at this every 2 years, and we're okay with letting it go, even if it means hard work to come up with a new curriculum that's more relevant.
Yeah, I would say there's like a component of, you certainly have to constantly revisit curriculum. And I also think it's okay to sometimes cull your catalog, so to speak. NeighborWorks has over 400 courses in our catalog. We're not going to successfully offer all those courses and get folks the training they need. So I think I mentioned earlier that I looked at sort of a group of courses, a cluster of courses on the foundations of community building and engagement and organizing. And we found that we actually did a better job with these 4 core courses than the 9 courses that preceded it, right? Like, so you've got to, and also honestly, people don't necessarily want, I think in adult learning, they don't want a replication of a degree program, right? That's not what adult learning is for most folks. It should be an option. I think micro credentials that ladder into those sorts of opportunities are great, but that's not where most people are going to be. So making sure your training can do as much as it can with limited space and limited practitioner space is really critical. And I would also say, I have to acknowledge, at NeighborWorks, the large majority of our resources are directly congressionally appropriated, which is great, but it also comes with some struggles sometimes. We have to follow government-style procurement rules, which unfortunately are not always the most equitable, right? And so when we can't always bring in the folks we need to bring in to do a training on a short-term basis, like, what's the alternative? We have a great network, 250 organizations. Is there a network leader who could actually, instead of just thinking about these folks as the consumers of training, are they potentially the leaders and the facilitators and the curriculum developers of training? And that to me is sort of the solution And if you have just professional delivers training, you're not actually meeting the moment, and you're not actually representing the truest current trends and needs.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, I think, I love this idea in some sense of what you're talking about, Cormac, is like, there's like a co-creation of what we need to know. And I think that that's a really important piece of how we make sure that what we're learning is relevant and what we're teaching is relevant. I would say the only other thing I'd add that we're sort of sitting with as an organization is, how do we really understand the trainings that are better in person versus the ones that are hybrid? And I think we're all struggling with that in this moment, right? And just sort of coming to realize like there are these things that really have to be done in person because that interpersonal, interrelational piece is so important to really having deeper, more meaningful conversations that actually can be implemented after you leave versus just being like, okay, thanks, that was a good Zoom call, and I might not do anything with that information. And so I think that's something for the field that we're all probably trying to figure out what's that right balance as work has shifted for all of us.
Great point. So we're going to shift right now to a brief exercise to get everybody on the call involved. It's going to be about 5 minutes, and then we'll come back for Q&A. So I'm going to turn it over to Heh.
Thanks, Miriam. Hi, everyone. Before we start the Q&A, we'd like to start with a quick audience activity. Get your finger working a little bit. So this exercise is designed to get us thinking about our ideal training experiences and to share our vision with one another. So here's how it will work. I will give you a prompt, and you will have a minute to type your response in the chat, but do not send it yet. Just type and hold your response. And on my handy, I guess on the left side of my or the right, whichever corner, there will be a 1 minute timer going on right here. And once that's done, you will hear my cue to enter it. So after you finish putting in your response, remember, hold it, don't send it, wait until my prompt. Okay, so let's get started with our first prompt. Now let me pull it up real quick. Okay, so here's the first prompt. What does a great training experience look like for you? Okay, what does a great training experience look like for you? You have 1 minute. All right, and I see that we already have response coming in. So if you're still typing your response, send it in, and just want you to see what's going on in the chat. Isn't it amazing? So let me have everyone to have their response flowing in. We have quite a lot of folks on the call, so it might take a while. But take a moment to read through the responses from your peers. And once you finish scrolling through them, you could think of if you can help me think of a single word, so only one word. You've been typing a lot of great information. So just think of one word that capture your reaction or feeling, then type that word as a reply. And the same rule, don't send it yet until the timer go off. So again, the prompt is take a moment to read through all the responses from your peer right here in the chat. Think of a single word that captures your reaction or feeling. Then type your word as a reply and wait for the timer to go off. All right, let's start. 1 minute. It would be helpful if I show it to you all, isn't it? All right, if you haven't already, let's get ready to send in your reaction and look through what everyone has been saying. I think there's a lot of thought and reaction into the chat, and I think this is a great exercise to see what everyone is thinking. So with that, I will hand it back to our panel. If you still haven't finished your thought on either of the prompt, please feel free to add it in the chat and continue the conversation. Thank you for your participation. And I think, Miriam, I think I'm passing back to you.
Yep. Thank you. So I'm looking at the Q&A from the audience, and we have a couple questions about access to training on a couple of different fronts, but we're going to start with money because a couple of people have brought this up, that the trainings that they may want are just expensive and it's hard to send staff to them. So just thoughts or advice on how to make trainings more financially accessible to especially small organizations.
We one of the it's an upside as much as the downside sometimes with our training is that we have in offering large trainings, there's a large infrastructure cost, which can make it expensive. And I think we have been successful. I want us to always be more successful, but we've been successful at building relationships with funders, outside funders, to provide scholarships. It can be frustrating because when those funders disappear, you know, like you've recreated an issue. But I do think I completely agree with what Joyce said. It's like some things just need to be done in person because of that like human connection that we've been talking about. So I think it's something we can't lose sight of. And I think if you can find a way, if you have a large training line of business to offset some of that in-person cost by lower cost, but perhaps less infrastructure dependent online trainings and things like that you can at least find a way to reduce your costs. But I do think the reality of training is that it can be very expensive. And I fully acknowledge that. I acknowledge NeighborWorks training is not free, right? But I think the storytelling around successes of training that are shared back with us have been really instrumental in helping us get some of that external support to bring down and defray some of this cost of training. And then I also think when we can come to you to do training, to do place-based training is, I think, generally a better experience and more effective, and it's more affordable. So that would be sort of my initial thought.
I was going to say that, you know, organizations like ours at national capacity, we're an intermediary, and we occasionally get really interesting opportunities for partnership with either funders or sponsors or even training organizations themselves. And so, I guess I would say like maybe look into some local intermediaries or trade groups who might be able to help leverage some of those relationships that they have to be able to get some of those training opportunities your way. I'll give an example. Our organization has a partnership with the Management Center, which has been really great because it's allowed us to help get reduced cost training for many of our members who want to improve their project management skills, as an example. And it's because we as an intermediary felt like, oh, this would benefit our network. So let's try to see if we can develop a relationship where we can bring that value as part of like a member benefit. So, I think we don't always think about those as opportunities, but those types of relationships with trade organizations and intermediaries can be really helpful in that way.
I don't know if I have anything. Sorry.
You don't have to. All right. So there's another angle to access though that we have a question on, and we did speak a little bit about accessibility earlier in various forms, but one of those forms of accessibility is health safety and immunocompromised and folks, or just people trying to be cautious. And what we're leaning into, and I understand you're saying a bunch of stuff about that extra, it is different in person. And yet most of the field has abandoned any other precautions for in-person events. So can you talk a little bit about, our questioner says, it's a bunch of folks who have been completely left out of training options by those choices. How do we handle that?
I mean, I think in-person is often the most effective, but it can't be the only option more often than not. I know at NeighborWorks, we're really trying to build to a point where all of our courses, all of our curriculum can be available in person, can be available online or in a hybrid model. And that takes time. It's a big investment. I also think it's incumbent on us to, when we think about the cost of in-person events, to build in the realities of people's health needs, in the same way we do security needs sometimes, or, other infrastructure needs. And people's health, our participants' health is like, should be top of mind in that. And, I know in our events, we have nurses and folks who are certified in response and public health response. And is it going to cover all opportunities or no? But then I do think that's where those online options are best and can be really effective as well.
So we have a question about tips for leaders who want to improve their communication and mentorship skills. Are there specific trainings out there about this or better ways to build that skill set?
Feel like I'm talking a lot, so I want to make sure I'm leaving space for others. But yes, we do offer some training. I mean, certainly communication training is common generally, but I think to actually tie it into community economic development, community building and engagement and organizing, we do have some courses in that area, and I think there are other organizations probably that do it really well also. I also do think that like the best experience is experience. And I think the things folks work or learn in getting out in their communities and meeting those resident leaders and having resident voices from ideation to implementation to evaluation, and it builds sort of the trust that makes communication easier. But yes, I can say NeighborWorks does offer some of those courses, though I know we're not alone in that.
I'm not aware of any, and I think the programs I've been involved in the past have they they've brought us in, both mentors and mentees. Spent an hour or so talking about how the program should be structured, what the time frame is, and leaves a lot of autonomy to the pairing. And you hear of successes in those pairings, and you sometimes hear of challenges in them. And whew, your question brings to mind that there it feels like there should be more kind of guidance and support on this front. I've been involved in both sides of that, and both sides have been really very rewarding for me, and feel like that, again, I brought it up earlier, I just think it's a really good investment for communities, whether it be a funder or an intermediary to help support this kind of activity in communities, to really build out the leadership bench for the greater community as well.
I was just going to throw in a couple of other folks that we've either partnered with or had an opportunity to benefit for training from. So the first one is, on the communication side, and this is a little bit more specific, but we've partnered with groups like the Op-Ed Project, which has been really helpful for articulating sort of communication more from an advocacy standpoint. So it's like helping you to refine what you want to be advocating on and communicating on. We've also partnered with a group called Training for Change, which does a lot of great training for primarily movement building organizations and community organizers, more around like how to facilitate, right? Because that's a different kind of skill set around communication. So wanted to kind of offer that. And then I think, just from a personal perspective, I've gone through programs like Rockwood, which has been actually a really helpful leadership development type of training that, it's not quite mentorship, but it does make you reflect on what is my leadership style? How do I want to show up as a leader? And that is part of mentorship, right? Like, how do I want to show up in support of the other people that I care about, that I want to support in this field? And so, I think thinking about some of those options, I hope those are helpful.
Great. So I'm looking at our last couple of questions, and we're very close to the end. So I want to do a quick lightning round with just some recommendations for the two remaining questions. Folks looking to get clear on the line between advocacy and lobbying and threading that needle, and one on recommendations for training for bankers. So not community development folks, but people adjacent that way. And then any other last thoughts you want to throw in. And everybody else, please fill out the poll.
Advocacy and lobbying, I think I always tried to walk that line. In my early years, at least here in Minnesota, the state legislature changed it up a bit. So basically, if you're talking with a legislature and it's not even have to be a huge threshold of time, you're considered a lobbyist, and you need to essentially file lobbying documents with the state. And so I've fallen into that category where previously I would argue I was doing advocacy work, and I think just to make sure that not crossing any lines, I'm now considered a lobbyist. I think at least in community development, I think it's a critical aspect of our work, and you need to be spending time with policymakers and educating them. And you could argue that truly is what you're doing. But I think just to be safe, at least here in Minnesota now, I think more and more people who formerly were advocating are now technically filing to be lobbyists, just because the local laws here. I don't know how representative that is of the nation.
I would also say, like, don't forget, nonprofits are allowed to lobby. That is allowed. There are certain lobbying activities that are not allowed. And I will say, if you want one specific plug, we do offer a course that I'm offering in October, specifically because it's right before an election, on what nonprofits are doing or can do in terms of advocacy versus legal and illegal lobbying. And I think that's really important things, but oftentimes nonprofits don't think that they're allowed to lobby, and that is not true. And the last thing to the banker question, I would say, find out what If you're trying to do financing, find out what local CDFIs and credit unions are doing. Maybe you support them. Go to those, show up for those nonprofits and ask them what they need. And then also remember to be focused on the assets that the communities you serve have rather than what you perceive as the challenges.
I do think it's important for your boards to know if you as an individual are making campaign contributions that you otherwise would not have. And I don't know if that's crossing any lines, but I just had a conversation with someone that now that I've left, my former organizational role, I'm up a decent amount of money because personally I was making a number of council member and state legislative types of contributions. And that feels like that was part of the game that I think a lot of directors are put into. And I know a number of my peers were doing the same thing. And I think just that is, it doesn't have to be everybody's reality, but I certainly think that, sometimes the role dictates that you have to play a different role for your organization, or you choose not to. But I think sometimes you pay the consequences of that as well.
Great. Well, we are at time, and I just did put a link in the chat on that last topic because if you can't get to a training, sometimes Shelter Force has a quick explainer that will give you a short introduction. That's my quick personal plug there. But thank you everyone for this panel and your insights, and look for the follow-up emails from the Alliance. And fill out your survey if you haven't. Thank you.